It all started with a simple report, the kind that usually gets lost among everyday paperwork. I am 35 years old and have served in these rainy, misty forests for 10 years, but I had never encountered anything like this. The reports came from the night shift rangers. They spoke of an animal that bore no resemblance to any known species in this region. No one could say for sure what it looked like. In fact, no one had seen it clearly. The only thing everyone agreed upon was the strange sound of running that was heard among the giant trees when the sun was completely hidden behind the mountains and the absolute darkness of the forest swallowed everything. The sound of something hitting wet foliage, the sound of dry firewood snapping under the weight of an unknown mass. But the main issue here was that no other sound accompanied it. No sounds of heavy breathing, no growls, not even a moan to show that a living creature was passing through all those obstacles. The forest is normally full of the sounds of life, but when that creature started running, the other sounds died. It was as if all of nature fell silent in the face of an alien presence. Like the others, I first thought these were just the hallucinations of a few tired rangers who had spent long nights in solitude and under the rain. But when one of my closest colleagues, a man who had worked in the toughest conditions for years, came to me with a pale face and said he felt something behind the trees was watching him without even blinking, I realized that the story went beyond a simple illusion. He said the creature was like a shadow whose speed was beyond human comprehension. I decided to take action myself. I couldn't let fear spread like a disease in the ranger station. I wanted to prove that everything in this forest has a logical explanation. But that night, as the rain pounded hard against the cabin roof, for the first time I felt a slight tremor in my hands that had nothing to do with the cold air. I felt that the forest was no longer the same safe home it used to be, and something was waiting in the darkness to see my first mistake. The next day, the atmosphere at the station was heavier than ever. The news of the disappearance of one of the experienced rangers, the one who had volunteered the night before to stay deep in the forest and discover the truth, exploded among us like a bomb. He was not a man to get lost easily or run away out of fear. He had taken a professional voice recorder with him to record any unusual activity. We spent all morning searching the area where he had been stationed. The heavy rain that had fallen all night had washed away most of the footprints, but eventually, we found something that was worse than finding a body. His tape recorder was sitting right on a tree trunk, without a scratch on it, but there was no sign of him. Not even a drop of blood or a piece of his clothing was seen. It was as if the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed him. When I brought the recorder back to the station, a deadly silence reigned in the control room. Everyone was waiting to find out what had happened in those final moments. I pressed the play button. At first, there was only the sound of rain hitting the microphone with a steady rhythm. Then the sound of crickets that suddenly stopped. Exactly as reported, the sound of footsteps was heard. Heavy and fast steps moving between the trees. The terrifying thing was that there was no sound of breathing in the audio file. Only the sound of flesh and bone hitting the wet ground. Suddenly, my colleague's voice rose, asking with a tremble if anyone was there. No answer came. After a few seconds, a terrifying struggle was heard, a sound like something heavy being dragged on the mud, and then a muffled moan that was quickly cut off. In the final seconds of the file, the sound of the environment became strangely quiet, as if the rain had also stopped. Then, a calm, cold, and completely human voice came from within the device, saying in a tone that seemed to come from the bottom of a deep well that it's your turn next. That voice did not belong to any of us. That voice didn't even seem to come from the throat of a living human. A shiver ran through my soul. As the senior officer, I now had to make a decision that might cost all of us our lives. I couldn't sleep that night. The words of that audio file were spinning in my brain like a drill. It's your turn next. To whom was this sentence addressed? To the one listening to the file, or to me who was now in charge of this case? I am 35 years old, and I have learned to face realities. But this time reality was different from what we knew. Early in the morning, despite strong opposition from the others, I decided to go alone to the exact spot where the recorder had been found. I felt that something had been left there that we hadn't noticed. When I reached the spot, a thick fog covered the entire ground. The trees looked like tall ghosts blocking my way. While I was preparing my camera, I noticed something among the thick bushes. I went closer and was faced with a scene that stopped my heart for a moment. A small wild dog, badly injured, and its leg caught among the twisted roots of an ancient tree. The poor animal didn't even have the strength to moan. Its body was full of tooth marks and deep scratches, but not like the wounds a normal predator creates. The wounds seemed precise and geometric. When I approached it, its eyes widened in fear. It wasn't afraid of me. It was terrified of what was behind me, deep in that thick fog. I carefully released its leg. The animal collapsed in my arms from pain and weakness. At that very moment, I suddenly heard that sound of running. Very close, maybe 10 meters away. But when I turned my head, I saw nothing. The fog began to swirl in an unnatural way. I remembered the words of my disappeared colleague. There was something in this forest that fed on the suffering of others. I picked up the dog and ran towards the cabin. I felt thousands of eyes following my path from among the branches. That night, when I took the dog to my temporary shelter and bandaged its wounds, I had a strange feeling. It was as if saving this small creature had created a bond between me and that dark force. The dog stared at the closed door with fear the whole time and barked every now and then with a trembling voice, as if someone was standing behind the door waiting to enter. The nighttime silence of the forest was never this heavy. I was sitting in the small ranger cabin and the dog I had saved was huddled in a corner. I named it Companion because it wouldn't leave my side like a shadow. The lantern light danced on the wooden walls and made crooked shadows, each of which seemed to me like that unknown creature. I checked my flashlight and put my weapon by my hand. But I knew that against whatever produced that sound, these tools might be useless. Suddenly, a rustling sound was heard from the roof. Something heavy was walking slowly on the shingles. Companion began to tremble and hit its head between its legs. I held my breath in my chest. The footsteps on the roof were different from the sound we had heard in the recorder. This time it was as if it deliberately wanted me to hear. Slow and intermittent. Suddenly, a sound like nails scratching on metal rose from the edge of the window. I didn't dare pull the curtain aside. Instead, I turned on the tape recorder. I wanted evidence to remain if anything happened to me. While I was pointing the camera at the door, I felt the room temperature drop drastically. I could see the steam of my breath in the lantern light. Then, that sound came again. But this time not from the device, but exactly from behind the cabin door. That same calm and cold voice. A voice that sounded as if its vocal cords were made of ice. It whispered, "Kindness is your weakness." My body froze. How could a creature in the forest understand the concept of kindness? Or maybe that creature wasn't an animal at all. Companion suddenly jumped up and barked at the door, but not normal barks, rather a sound that smelled of despair. I picked up my weapon and opened the door lock with trembling hands. I had to face it. Running away in this forest was useless. When I opened the door, there was only absolute darkness and the strong smell of rain and wet earth. But on the cabin step, something was placed that took my breath away. My disappeared colleague's hat, perfectly intact, but inside it was filled with black wildflowers that grew only in the deepest and most inaccessible parts of the forest. This was a message showing that he wasn't coming back, and I was now the main target of this game. The following days, I lived in a constant state of suspense. Every step I took in the forest, I felt like I was walking on the edge of a blade. Companion, that little dog, its wounds were now healed, but its behavior never became normal. It always stared at spots that seemed empty to me. Sometimes in the middle of the night, it would attack the empty space of the room and show its teeth in the air. I began to research the history of this area. In old libraries of distant towns, among forgotten notes, I came across legends that spoke of the voice hunter, a creature that was said to have been present in these forests since ancient times and traps its victims by imitating their voices. But what was more terrifying in these legends was that this creature never killed anyone unless it first brought them to the brink of madness. It fed on fear, not flesh. I realized that my colleague was probably still alive, but in a place beyond our perception. One evening, as the rain was falling gently, I noticed strange footprints around the cabin. The footprints looked like human footprints, but the distance of each step to the next was more than 3 meters. It was as if someone had danced around my house with impossible strides. In the center of these footprints, I found an old and decayed piece of paper. On it, in handwriting that looked exactly like my own, was written, "Help me." My heart was pounding hard. Was this a trap, or was my colleague really sending a message from somewhere? Companion was standing next to me at that moment, barking fiercely. It ran towards the depths of the forest and came back, as if it wanted to show me a way. I decided to follow it. I picked up my flashlight, and as night was arriving, I entered the heart of darkness. The further I went, the taller the trees became and their branches more intertwined. The fog appeared again, but this time its color leaned towards purple. A strange smell hung in the air, a smell like the combination of rusted iron and crushed flowers. Suddenly, Companion stopped and began to moan. We had reached a place that did not exist on the maps, an open space in the middle of the forest where in its center stood an old stone well. The stone well seemed to have emerged from the heart of the earth. Its stones were covered with black and slimy moss that glistened under my flashlight. Companion refused to get close to the well and kept circling around itself and moaning at a safe distance. I stood at the edge of the well and threw the light inside. Its depth was not clear. It was as if the light of my flashlight was swallowed by the thick darkness at the bottom of the well. Suddenly, a voice rose from the bottom of the well. Not that cold and alien voice, but the sound of a child crying. The sound was so real and heartbreaking that for a moment I forgot all the warnings of my mind. I wanted to find a rope and go down, but Companion suddenly grabbed my clothes with its teeth and pulled me back with force. It was barking fiercely and shaking its head in disapproval. At that moment, the crying stopped and turned into a loud and ear-piercing laugh. A laugh that gradually changed shape and turned into the recorded sound of my own voice saying, "It's your turn next." Terror took over my whole being. I was facing something that knew not only sounds, but also my thoughts and feelings. I distanced myself from the well, but realized that I had lost the way back. The trees seemed to have shifted behind me to block the way out. My compass was spinning wildly. Meanwhile, I noticed that Companion was staring in a direction. In the dim light of the trees, I saw a man standing with his back to me. He was wearing a ranger uniform. I called out, "Hey, is that you?" The man turned slowly, but when his face came into the light of my flashlight, I wished I had never looked. He had no face. Instead of eyes, nose, and mouth, there was only a smooth surface and stretched skin on which a large smile was drawn with something like charcoal. He stretched out his hand towards me, and while he had no mouth, my colleague's voice was clearly heard from his chest saying, "Come, it's not cold here." I started running. Without a target, I just wanted to get away from that creature. Companion ran ahead of me, clearing the way through the thorny bushes. I heard the sound of that creature running behind me. Without breathing, only the sound of heavy feet hitting the ground. It was as if it was playing with me, like a cat playing with a half-dead mouse. Running through the dark and misty forest was like running in an endless nightmare. Branches clawed at my face like dry hands, and tree roots constantly cropped up under my feet to knock me down. Companion ran at an incredible speed and stood every now and then to make sure I was still behind it. The sound of the heavy footsteps of that faceless creature didn't stop for a moment. It seemed the distance was constant. It neither got closer nor further. It wanted to exhaust me. Suddenly, I reached a river that had no record in this part of the forest. Its water was black and thick and passed over the rocks with a jarring sound. An old wooden bridge was over the river which seemed to collapse with the slightest touch. Companion went onto the bridge with hesitation, and I followed it. When I reached the middle of the bridge, I felt something was directly under my feet. I threw the light of the flashlight down. Among the black water, I saw thousands of human faces staring at me with open and soulless eyes. They weren't screaming, they just opened and closed their mouths, as if they were wanting oxygen. The bridge began to shake. The faceless creature now stood at the edge of the river. It did not enter the water. It just stood and watched me with its charcoal smile. It raised its hand and pointed towards the sky. At that moment, the rain stopped and instead, something like warm ash started falling from the sky. A strong smell of burning filled the air. Companion pulled my clothes with force and took me to the other side of the river. We reached a ruined cabin that had a strange resemblance to my own cabin, but it looked as if 100 years had passed since its life. The door and windows were broken, and the inside was full of black spider webs. I entered and closed the door behind me with a heavy stone slab. In a corner of the room, there was an old radio that, despite not being connected to any power source, was broadcasting a sharp noise. Among the noises, I heard a voice that was saying the exact geographic coordinates of somewhere. When I paid attention, I realized those coordinates were exactly where I was standing now. The radio said, "The subject entered the cage. Start the final phase." I was imprisoned in that ruined cabin. Companion was sitting next to me, and its body was trembling violently. I tried to calm myself. I had to use my head. This creature, or whatever it was, did not follow physical rules, but it seemed to have a specific mental structure. It used sounds and memories to make its victim surrender. The radio continued to play noise and had now started playing the sound of my childhood. My mother's voice singing a lullaby for me. This voice was so real that for a moment I closed my eyes and felt I was back in my old bedroom. But Companion brought me back to reality with a loud bark. It was staring at the cabin wall. On the wall, damp and moisture stains were gradually changing shape and forming letters. Black and slimy letters that were dripping from the wall. It was written, "It never leaves. It has become a part of you." I turned my flashlight around and noticed that my shadow on the wall was no longer coordinated with my movements. When I raised my hand, the shadow on the wall remained static. When I shook my head, the shadow turned my head in another direction. My shadow on the wall had now become independent and was coming back towards me. It was coming out of the wall's surface, like a piece of black cloth entering our world from another dimension. I jumped back in terror. Companion attacked that black mass with frantic barks. To my surprise, my shadow on the wall, instead of me, attacked that little dog. It was as if that creature wanted to destroy my only companion. I picked up the old axe that was lying in the corner of the cabin and struck at my own shadow. The axe passed through the blackness without hitting anything, but a sound like the moan of an injured animal filled the room. At that same moment, the cabin roof began to collapse. A strong tremor shook the whole ground. I and the dog jumped out of the cabin and saw that the whole forest was changing. The trees had long hands instead of branches stretched towards the sky, and the moon in the sky, like a large and red eye, was staring directly at us. The ground was opening its mouth under my feet, and tree roots were crawling out of the soil like giant snakes. There was no longer any way back. I felt I was in the center of a metaphysical storm. The faceless creature appeared again, this time not in the distance, but just a few steps from me. It had now become taller, and its body seemed to be made of thick black smoke. It didn't speak, but its thoughts were being broadcasted directly into my brain. It was saying that I had been chosen to be the new narrator of this forest. It was saying that every ranger who had disappeared was now a part of this system, and it was my turn to surrender my consciousness to this darkness. Companion, that loyal dog, despite its fear, had shielded me. It attacked the black creature, but every time it was thrown back as if hitting a wall. I held the axe firmly in my hand, but I knew this weapon had no effect on it. Suddenly, I remembered the dog. Why had this creature attacked the dog among all animals? Why had it left the dog in the forest for me to find? A thought sparked. The dog was not a bait. The dog was an anchor. This creature couldn't easily enter my mind unless I created a strong emotional bond with something in this forest. Saving the dog had actually invited that creature into the innermost part of my heart. It had used my kindness to break my mental barriers. I looked at the dog. Its eyes were full of grief, as if it knew this itself. The faceless creature got closer. I could now feel the icy cold emanating from it. It put its hand on my shoulder. I felt the blood in my veins freezing. The voices of thousands of people started screaming in my head. All my memories, from the first day of school to the last time I had talked to my family, were passing before my eyes like a fast-forwarded film. It was draining me. At that moment, the dog made a move I didn't expect. Instead of attacking the creature, It came towards me and bit my hand. A sharp pain twisted through my body, and this very pain pulled me out of that mental void for a moment. The pain of the dog bite was like an electric shock that brought me back to reality. That mental bond broke for a few seconds. I moved back, trembling and sweating. The faceless creature made a sound for the first time, a long and jarring moan that was like metal being dragged on stone. It seemed furious at this interruption. Companion stood in front of me while blood was dripping from its mouth. It was no longer trembling. Its eyes had taken on a strange color, a combination of blue and gold that shone in the darkness. I felt that this dog was not an ordinary animal. Maybe it too was a guardian who had waited for centuries in this forest for someone to be found who still has a human heart. The faceless creature stretched its smoky hands to take me again, but Companion gave a loud bark that spread a wave of white light in the space. For a moment, the darkness retreated and I was able to see the true face of my surroundings. We were in an old cemetery where trees had grown over the graves. All those cabins and rivers were illusions that the creature had built to draw me here. The graves were open, and from inside them, shiny wires went towards the roots of the trees. It was as if the forest was a massive biological machine that fed on the souls of the dead. Companion pointed in a direction, a stone portal from which a faint light was emanating. It wanted me to escape, but the faceless creature quickly reconstructed itself, and this time, it fully took the shape of that same disappeared colleague of mine. It said with a completely real voice, "Please don't go. If you go, I'll be left here alone. They are torturing me. Only you can save me." Its voice was so honest that my legs went weak. It was using the last remnants of my humanity against me. Companion came towards me and nudged my hand with its nose, as if saying, "Don't listen, it's not him." I had to choose between saving myself and risking everything to save my friend. But I knew if I stayed, we would both become part of this machine forever. I stood and stared into the eyes of that creature that looked like my colleague. For a moment, I felt it was really him. The grief in its gaze was tearing my heart to pieces. But when I looked down, I saw that its shadow did not exist on the ground. It was just a hollow image. With a voice I tried not to let tremble, I said, "You are not my colleague." He would never ask me to sacrifice myself. Upon saying this sentence, its face cracked like a plaster mask and collapsed. Under that mask, there was only void. The faceless creature returned to its original shape, a mass of smoke and shadow that had now become larger and more terrifying. It let out a shriek that shook all the trees in the cemetery. Companion ran towards the light portal, and I followed it with all my strength. I felt the ground under my feet was becoming soft, as if I was walking on living flesh. The faceless creature followed us with incredible speed. It stretched its hands and managed to catch the edge of my coat. I felt a 1,000-ton weight was attached to me. I was being pulled towards the darkness. Companion turned back and with a high leap, attacked the heart of that black mass directly. The light shining from the dog's eyes hit the blackness of the creature, and an explosion of energy occurred. I was thrown forward and fell exactly at the edge of the light portal. At that moment, everything became quiet. I turned to call the dog, but I didn't see it. It was caught in the darkness and was fighting that creature with all its being. It was sacrificing itself so I could escape. Tears welled up in my eyes. I couldn't leave it alone, but the light portal was closing. In the final second, I heard the dog's voice, not as a bark, but a voice in my mind saying, "Go. Finish the story." With one movement, I threw myself into the light. I felt my body was disintegrating, and then absolute blackness. When I opened my eyes, the sharp smell of the hospital and the steady beep of medical devices were the first things I sensed. My body was so heavy that it felt as if it were made of lead. A nurse came towards me and, seeing that I was awake, quickly called the doctor. They told me that I had been in a coma for 3 days. I had been found on the edge of the forest, lying unconscious on the ground with my body full of deep scratches. No one believed how I had managed to survive that dangerous area. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. When I finally managed to make a sound, I asked, "The dog? Where's that dog?" The doctor looked at me with surprise and said that when they found me, no animal was with me. They thought I was hallucinating. But I knew Companion was real. It had saved me. A few days later, when I was able to walk a little, the police came for questioning. They were following the case of my colleague's disappearance. I recounted all the events, from the tape recorder, from the faceless creature, from the stone well, and from the dog's sacrifice. They looked at me with sympathy, as if I were telling fictional stories. One of the officers brought the tape recorder and said, "We checked this again. There is no sound in it except the noise of the wind. There is no sentence like, 'It's your turn next.'" I was shocked. How was it possible? I had heard that voice myself. When they left the room, I was left alone. I stared at the window facing the forest. The forest looked calm and beautiful from afar, but I knew what was going on in its depths. Suddenly, I noticed something on the cabinet next to my bed. An old and worn-out dog collar, on whose metal plate no name was written. That collar wasn't there when I woke up. A shiver ran through my body. Did it mean it had also returned? I took the dog collar in my hand. Its metal was cold, but it gave me a familiar feeling. On the plate, instead of a name, a date was engraved. A date from 100 years ago. I felt the story wasn't over. I had to go back to that forest, not out of curiosity, but to find Companion. I owed it. I escaped from the hospital at night. Despite the pain in my legs, I reached the edge of the forest. It was rainy, and a thick fog danced among the trees. This time I wasn't armed. I only had that collar in my hand. When I entered the first row of trees, I felt the forest recognized me. The branches, instead of blocking the way, moved slowly aside. I heard the sound of running again. But this time, the sound wasn't heavy. It was light and fast, exactly like the steps of that little dog. I called out, "Hey, where are you?" No answer came, but a faint and golden light shone from afar among the trees. I followed the light. The further I went, the clearer my memories became. It was as if the forest was returning parts of my memory that the creature had stolen. I reached the same spot where the light portal had closed. Now there was only a circle of burnt ground. In the center of that circle sat my little dog. But it was no longer an ordinary dog. Its body was semi-transparent, and a light shone from within it. It looked at me and wagged its tail. But its eyes were no longer canine. They were the eyes of that same disappeared colleague of mine. Terror and surprise came to me simultaneously. Was he imprisoned in the body of this animal? Or was this dog always a part of his soul? The dog barked in a direction. In the darkness behind it, the faceless creature was forming again. But this time, it seemed weaker. The dog took the collar from my hand and threw it towards the creature. The collar shone in the air and wrapped around the black mass like a chain. The faceless creature let out a cold moan and gradually became smaller and smaller until it sank completely into the ground. The dog came towards me and rubbed its head against my hand. I felt this was our last meeting. It was going somewhere I couldn't follow. With the disappearance of the creature and its sinking into the ground, the entire atmosphere of the forest suddenly changed. The purple fog dispersed quickly and was replaced by a cool breeze that smelled of real wildflowers. The dog, with those shining eyes that I was now sure held a human soul behind them, looked at me for the last time. The light emanating from its body slowly faded, and it turned into a real, earthy dog. But it was no longer that injured and weak dog. It now stood healthy and steady. I took it in my arms. The warmth of its body assured me that this time there was no illusion. We moved together towards the ranger station. When we arrived, dawn was breaking. My colleagues were shocked to see me emerging from the heart of the forest safe and sound, accompanied by a dog. They thought I had gotten lost again. I made no more effort to explain the terrifying truth of that creature to them. I knew they would never believe it. Instead, I just said I found the way and this dog helped me. In the following weeks, peace returned to the forest. There was no more news of those strange sounds or mysterious disappearances. But I knew that darkness had only fallen asleep, not been destroyed. Companion was always with me. It had become my loyal guardian. But one night, as I was sitting in my cabin listening to the sound of the rain, something strange happened. I was busy cleaning my former colleague's belongings when I found a diary in his desk drawer. On its last page, something was written that froze the blood in my veins. It said, "The faceless creature is not our enemy. It is a mirror. It only returns to us what we are running away from in the depths of our hearts. It wants to wake us up. I looked at Companion sleeping on the carpet. It suddenly opened its eyes and stared at me. For a second, I felt that charcoal smile appeared again in the corner of its lips. That night, reading that writing, all my beliefs collapsed. If that creature was a mirror, then what I had seen was a part of myself. Fear, isolation, and that ugly smile. Were these the hidden parts of my soul? I looked at Companion. It was staring at me calmly, but now I could no longer trust it like before. Every move it made, every sound it produced, came under the magnifying glass of my doubt. I started searching the whole cabin. I felt something was hidden here. Under the floorboards of the room, I found a small metal box. Inside the box were several old cassette tapes. I put one of them into the recorder and played it. The voice that was heard was not mine, nor was it my colleague's. It was the voice of an old man who was a ranger in this forest years ago. He said, "Anyone who stares into the darkness of this forest for a long time, the darkness also stares into him. But these animals, these dogs, they are the only ones who can bear the weight of this truth. They sacrifice themselves so we don't go mad." I realized that the dog was actually carrying a part of the weight of my soul. It had imprisoned that creature in itself so I could return to a normal life. But this sacrifice had a price. The dog became weaker day by day. Its hair had turned gray and it no longer had the urge to run. It was melting away bit by bit. I felt that darkness was eating it from the inside. One night, a heavy rain started falling, similar to the night my colleague disappeared. The dog got up and went towards the door. It looked at me, a long and farewell look. It wanted to return to the forest. It wanted to return that darkness to its home before it was completely destroyed itself. I didn't want to let it go, but I knew if it stayed, we would both be destroyed. I opened the door for it. It entered the fog and never returned. But that night, when I fell asleep, for the first time I heard the sound of someone breathing next to my bed. A calm and steady sound. I woke up, but I didn't dare open my eyes. The sound of breathing was exactly next to my ear. The smell of wet earth and something like burnt wool filled the room. When I finally opened my eyes, no one was there. But on my bed sheet, the muddy paw prints of a dog were seen. I knew Companion hadn't gone. It had only changed its shape. It had now become a part of the house, a part of the air in the room. The next day, when I went to the station chief summoned me. He showed me old files and said that my colleague was not the only one who had disappeared. Over the past 50 years, every 10 years, a ranger would disappear and a stray dog was always found just before that. He said in a worried tone, "The next turn has arrived, and we are worried about you. You have changed a lot." I looked in the mirror. He was right. My eyes were sunken and my skin had become pale. But what scared me most of all was that when I smiled, I felt my lips were stretching more than usual, exactly like that charcoal smile. I began to hear voices. Not in the forest, but among the everyday conversations of people. When someone spoke to me, in the background of their words, I heard whispers saying, "Come, return, time is up." I realized that the creature, or that mirror, was no longer in the forest, it was inside me. Companion had tried to take it with itself, but that heart connection I had created by saving it had made a permanent path for the darkness to enter. I decided to do something before I completely lost control. I had to return to the same cemetery and face myself. I had lived with pride for 35 years, and I didn't want to be remembered as a monster. I moved towards the forest, but this time, I took the tape recorder too. I wanted to record the truth to the end this time. The forest was not silent this time. The sound of thousands of whispers was heard among the leaves. It was as if the trees were consulting each other on what to do with me. I went towards the heart of the forest without stopping. I knew the way, as if a new instinct had awakened in me. When I reached the cemetery, I noticed the graves were no longer open. They were covered with black wildflowers that smelled of death. In the center of the cemetery sat that same faceless creature. But it no longer looked terrifying. It was tired and suffering. It had taken my shape, but a version that had aged years. It took the tape recorder from my hand and turned it on. No noise was heard, only the beat of a heart, a calm and firm beat. It said, "Do you think I hunted you?" "No." I was just waiting for you to forgive yourself." I didn't understand what it was saying. It continued, "Years ago, you couldn't save someone. You are the carrier of a grief that feeds this forest. That dog, it was just the symbol of your forgiveness." Suddenly a memory I had suppressed for years came back like a roaring wave. An accident I had in my youth, an animal that had died under my car, and I had fled in fear. That suffering, that small sin, was the root of all this darkness. The faceless creature put its hand on my heart. I felt a heavy stone was lifted from my chest. All those voices, all those ugly smiles suddenly vanished. The creature gradually became transparent and gave its place to that little dog. Companion appeared again, but this time it was completely real. It was no longer a part of my soul. It was itself. It ran in a direction and took me towards a hidden cabin. When I opened the door, I saw my colleague. He was alive, but in a deep sleep. He had been protected here by that dog all this time. I woke him with difficulty. My colleague started crying when he saw me. He said that all this time, he had been in a space between sleep and wakefulness, and a voice was constantly telling him that the next turn was on the way. Together, and with Companion's help, we found the way back. When we emerged from the forest, I felt a strange weight had been lifted from the shoulder of the whole forest. The sun had risen, and its light, like golden swords, was breaking the darkness. We returned to the station, and this time, everyone was shocked to see him. He was taken to the hospital, and I went with him. But Companion, it stood at the edge of the forest and came no further. It looked into my eyes, and with a short bark, returned to the depths of the trees. I realized it was the guardian there, and its place was there. But the story didn't end here. A few days later, while I was packing my things to go on leave for a while, I found the tape recorder in my pocket. I became curious and pressed the play button. None of those previous sounds were there. No heartbeat, no sound of rain. Only my own voice, with a very calm tone, as if revealing a secret, saying, "Thank you for freeing me. Now I can rest in peace." I had never recorded such a sentence. I looked in the mirror with fear. My face had become normal again, but when I looked closely into my eyes, I saw a small and golden point shining in the depth of the pupils. A light I had inherited from that loyal dog. I returned home, but every night, before sleep, I checked the recorder. Because I know darkness is always looking for a new way to return. And now, I am the only one who holds the key to that portal. My leave ended, and I returned to work. But I was no longer that same person. Now every time I heard the sound of something running in the forest, I wasn't afraid. I knew this was either Companion standing guard, or the wind whistling through the trees. My colleague also returned to work, but he no longer went deep into the forest. He stayed in the administrative section and never spoke about those nights again. One day, a new report reached me. A tourist claimed to have heard a child's laugh near the stone well. I knew I had to go and investigate. When I reached the spot, the stone well was completely filled with soil. No sound was heard, but on the edge of the well sat a small dog bone tied with a red ribbon. This was a sign that the faceless creature was not coming back, but something else had replaced it. Something that was neither necessarily evil nor necessarily kind. Nature had found its balance again. I was returning to the station when I felt someone was watching me. I turned, but no one was there. Only a pair of golden eyes shone in the darkness among the bushes and then disappeared. I smiled and continued on my way. I now understood that horror is just one side of the coin. The other side is awareness. Awareness that we are not alone in this world and our actions, even the smallest kindnesses, have a large reflection in the cosmos. I reached my cabin and turned on the light. The recorder was on the table. For the last time, I picked it up and threw it towards the forest. There was no longer any need to record anything. The truth was engraved in my heart. But just as I wanted to close the door, I heard a rustling sound from under the bed. My heart started pounding hard. Had it started again? I slowly went to the bed and lifted the edge of the sheet. Nothing was there. Only a cold wind blowing through the crack in the wall. I breathed a sigh of relief and sat on the bed. But suddenly, I felt the room temperature dropping rapidly. The lantern on the table went out for no reason. In absolute darkness, I heard the rotation of the gears of an old device. The sound of that same recorder I had thrown into the forest moments ago. The sound was coming from the table. The play button was pressed automatically. A loud noise filled the room. And then, that same cold and familiar voice rose again. But this time, it was not talking to my colleague or me. It had a friendly tone, as if it were talking directly to the person who is hearing this story right now. It whispered with the same deadly calmness. Did you think the story was over? Did you think because that ranger was saved, you two are safe? I was frozen in the darkness. I felt that creature was no longer in the forest. It had found its way to the outside world through these words, through this voice. The voice continued. That dog was just an excuse for you to listen, for you to open the door. I felt that something was standing behind me, just a few centimeters from my neck. I didn't feel the warmth of its breath, because it had no breath, but I felt the weight of its gaze on my skin. It slowly, with a voice that now no longer sounded like anyone, said its final sentence. A sentence that made the hair on my body stand up and made me realize that this story never has an end. It said, "My story is over, but now, it's your turn next. Right now as you are listening to me, turn around and look behind you." I didn't dare turn around. Do you dare? Right now, in the darkness of your room, don't you feel someone is watching you from between my words? Next turn, it's yours.